Russia wanted to show strength. Instead, they exposed weakness. After shelling Ukrainian cities with 574 drones and dozens of missiles, Moscow expected fear. What they got was Operation Iron Thunder, a joint Ukrainian and American strike so comprehensive it decimated air bases, fuel depots, and communication networks overnight. So here's the challenge. Can you watch the sequence of this operation unfold without questioning whether the global balance of power just shifted in those few hours? Let's see if you can hold that thought when you see the final outcome. Before we move on, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Russia framed the strike as a show of dominance, but the first images told a different story. Rows of burned apartments, crushed cars, and families pulling torn clothing from piles of dust. Those 574 kamikaze drones and 40 ballistic missiles did not descend on armored convoys or military barracks. They crashed instead into kindergarten classrooms, grocery stores, and narrow streets where children had been playing just minutes before. For the first time since the war began, entire towns awoke not to the thunder of artillery at the front, but to the sight of their own neighborhoods collapsing around them. In the span of a single night, the front lines moved from the trenches to the living rooms of ordinary people. Families sprinted into underground shelters, dragging pets and babies, unsure which roof would still stand at dawn. Electricity grids failed. Phone towers snapped into sparks. Hospitals flooded with casualties not in uniforms, but in pajamas. It was not chaos born of miscalculation. The pattern of targets revealed intent. Airfields untouched, barracks left standing. Instead, the destruction formed a map of intimidation, a message hammered into Ukraine with fire. One doctor described entire wards filled with school-aged children suffering burns and shrapnel wounds. Firefighters ran so thin that volunteers dragged garden hoses across courtyards already flooded with ash. That same morning in a smaller town, a mother sat beside the body of her son, weeping into a blood-soaked jacket no larger than a backpack. For her, there was no political calculation, no strategic framing, only the unbearable knowledge that her country was being punished through her child. Stories like hers gathered speed across Ukraine in whispered phone calls between relatives trying to locate each other in the dark. To outside observers, the scale felt bizarre, almost disproportionate. Why level homes when enemy tanks were closer at hand? But for Kyiv's leadership, there was no doubt. Russia wanted shock to replace logic. Moscow wanted Americans watching to question their investment, to see Ukraine as defenseless and doomed. The attack was not just about killing civilians. It was about provoking fear, creating images designed to circulate in Washington, Brussels, and every newsroom with a headline that shouted weakness. Inside the presidential compound, the decision came down to hours. Act too swiftly and risk igniting a confrontation bigger than the war itself. Wait too long, and the silence would cement Russia's message that Ukraine could be struck without consequence. Advisors debated whether to involve Washington directly, knowing the answer could determine not only the fate of Kyiv, but the trajectory of European security. In Moscow, footage of smoke-filled skylines ran on loop as proof of victory. In American offices, strategists called emergency meetings to interpret the meaning behind each detonation. Inside Ukraine, the strike was existential, a bid to erase civilian resolve by making survival itself feel temporary. Yet what followed surprised all three audiences. Ukraine rejected despair. It rejected silence. Officials chose retaliation, designed not in fear, but in coordination with their strongest ally. For the first time, American and Ukrainian planners stitched together a unified counterattack across land, air, and sea in real time. That unprovoked barrage ceased to be a demonstration of Moscow's strength. It became the trigger for Ukraine's defining moment, the instant the nation shifted from absorbing punishment to taking command of its own defense. What was meant to paralyze instead activated resolve, and what began in mourning was already setting the stage for a storm rolling east in the hours ahead. Hours after neighborhoods across Ukraine went dark under Russian fire, skies east of the border erupted with an entirely different storm. Hundreds of drones rose at once, forming a swarm so dense radar screens flickered and jammed themselves trying to track the movement. This was not a random pushback. It had a name, Operation Iron Thunder. And from the very beginning, Moscow had no script to answer it. The planning window for such a massive counterstrike could have stretched months under normal conditions, yet this was sketched out in a single night. Washington's intelligence satellites downloaded targeting grids directly to Kyiv. Pentagon analysts stayed awake, transmitting coordinates, flight timings, and sequencing models. Ukraine brought the stamina, the launch crews, and the survival instinct sharpened after 2 years of constant bombardment. The U.S. filled the role of mentor, quiet but decisive, guiding resources into place and coordinating sky-to-surface operations tighter than NATO exercises. What bound them together was the knowledge that hesitation carried risks as dangerous as escalation itself. The tightrope was terrifying. A strike too heavy could provoke Russia to claim NATO had finally entered the battlefield directly. A strike too weak would feed into Moscow's assumption that Ukraine could not bite back. In those conversations, every step felt like walking toward a split point in history. Kyiv's leadership did not ask what would happen in 6 months. They asked what needed to happen in the next 6 hours to prevent Russia from writing the narrative that Ukraine had already lost. By dawn, the scale of Iron Thunder became clear. Over 200 long-range combat drones were prepared in scattered airfields. HIMARS and Vilka rocket systems rolled into concealed positions near the tree line. Dozens of stealth bombers remained on standby, machines never officially acknowledged as part of the theater, but now positioned to strike. Submarines crept beneath the Black Sea, waiting for the cue to launch Tomahawk missiles. Overhead, fighters from both generations, F-35s and F-22s, had already rehearsed maneuvers to suppress any Russian aircraft that lifted from their western bases. This was no piecemeal action. It was a synchronized blow across land, air, and sea. The first punch came from Ukraine itself. 1,200 drones surged across the border, flying low and fast. Interceptors scrambled. Russian missile batteries roared, thinning the swarm with bursts of fire, but sheer volume gave Ukraine the edge. Hundreds went down in flames. Hundreds more slipped through. Fuel trucks at supply depots erupted into orange light. Armored rail transport loaded with tanks turned into a twisted wreck on the tracks. Ammunition bunkers burst from within, scattering shards of steel into the night sky. One after another, vital nodes collapsed. Not because every drone made it, but because enough made it through the cracks. Even as Moscow's interceptors fired in panic, defenses showed strain. Reload crews scrambled in confusion. Radar arrays overloaded, mistaking decoys for threats, and failing to lock onto actual warheads. Minutes mattered. Systems designed for slow patterns were now facing a flood, and in that flood, cracks opened everywhere. Then came the American strikes. New Generation B-21 Raiders unleashed payloads on runways, where Russian bombers sat loaded. Submerged submarines fired Tomahawks that curved inland, smashing hardened command bunkers thought untouchable. High above, F-22 Raptors picked apart Russian fighters one by one, while F-35s jammed communications and cut through the air at speeds too fast for most defenses to target. This wasn't just punishment, it was paralysis. Within hours, Russia's western military grid fractured, fuel pipelines ruptured, rail junctions froze in twisted heaps of steel. Armor columns stranded without fuel became easy prey for roaming drones. Secure lines went silent. For the first time in months, Russian commanders faced darkness, not because they had imposed it on others, but because their own systems had been gutted. Russia set out to terrify civilians, but the strike back exposed how fragile its defenses had become under pressure. The attempt to project dominance collapsed the moment Ukraine, with American guidance, answered with precision and scale that Moscow could not match. What began with homes in ashes turned into a counterstrike that shifted the balance of power overnight. Ukraine's story followed the arc of survival to defiance, from victim to victor. And that leaves a final question. If true strength begins with refusing intimidation, what message does that send to every rival power still watching closely today?